Welcome everyone to CG seminar number 165, and our topic today is ableism in academia, theorising experiences of disabilities and chronic illnesses in higher education. And it's a book symposium, and Nicole Brown is going to tell us about the book at a later stage of the webinar. We've got three speakers for you today. Our main speaker was Gregor Walbring. I'm going to bring Gregor in a minute. I'll just run through the standard webinar protocols with you. The webinar is being recorded and will be posted online on the CG website in due course, and a transcript of the chat function will also be posted. Please keep yourself muted unless you have been asked to speak or ask a question. There's no need to have your video on during the webinar, but please do so when you're asking a question. We recommend using the speaker view setting in Zoom so you can more clearly see who is talking. To ask a question, use the chat function. Write out your question and we will select the questions in the Q&A part of the discussion. The order in which we receive them has a lot of bearing on the order in which we present them. We tend to mix them up a little bit in terms of topic and so on. But I do advise you that if you want to enter the discussion through the Q&A, and it's often the best part of our webinars, then do so by writing your question down early. Questions that come in the last 5-10 minutes often don't end up getting heard. When you're invited to ask your question, and I'll give you some warning in the chat, but when I formally invite you over the microphone, please unmute yourself, which is always the most important step. Switch on your video and state your name and where you are from, and then ask your question. At this point, it's a delight to welcome Gregor Walbring. Gregor is tenured associate professor at the University of Calgary in Canada. He's at the Cummings School of Medicine, Community Health Sciences, Community Rehabilitation and Disability Studies. He's widely published 105 peer-reviewed journal articles. That's quite a lot of work, and more than 40 book chapters. He describes himself as an ability, expectation and ableism studies, disability studies, science and technologies and sustainability scholar. So there's a lot of issues in there. He's received a raft of awards. I'll draw your attention to his fuller bio in the CG website, but I think at this point, the best thing we can do is to bring in Gregor. Welcome, Gregor.
Hello, welcome. Thank you. Okay, so I'm right away sharing here. So people should now see my PowerPoint. Can someone give me the sum up? Okay, and then we do from the beginning. So you should get full screen. Okay. I have to see whether I move, where do I move this one? Let's move it there. Okay, thanks a lot for having me for this book launch, for this very important book. And I want to simply add some more content to it from a Canadian perspective, mostly. Before I start, I would like to thank the Wolbring, that's my student group, which are mostly undergraduates, which work with me all the way from year one, right out of high school. I also should say, can I get rid of this? Okay, I have to get rid of your pictures. This is my home, and you can see we call them people of diverse abilities, the people we serve. We don't use disability or impairment or whatever because of the uncertainty of how these things get interpreted. As Simon says, I'm an ability studies scholar, who investigates ability expectation, one stage, nice to have, and ableism, need stage, ability, essential to have, hierarchies and preferences, and the impact of such hierarchies. Of course, I'm indebted to the disability rights movement, who coined the term ableism all the way back in the 1960s and 70s to question irrelevant normative body ability expectations and the ability privileges, the ability to work, to gain education, to be part of society, to have a positive identity, to be seen as a citizen, that come with them, and the disableism, the ability expectation and ableism oppression, the negative treatment of the ones judged as impaired as ability wanted by applying irrelevant body ability expectations. With irrelevant, I mean, I'm in a wheelchair and I would not expect to be a frontline fire worker. But if I can't work at the desk in a fire hall because of a non-accessible washroom, that is irrelevant body ability expectation. As to AA, I use this beyond body-mind linked abilities. For me, AA is about the ability to live out certain values and belief and to have a good life. And all the strifes we see in the moment, right, in countries is where different groups simply have different ability expectations around values and beliefs, and a lot of them feel that they can't have a good life. AA dynamic exists between humans in general, not just the so-called impaired and non-impaired, but also humans, animals, nature, increasingly post-transhuman cyborg humans, humans, non-sentient machines, as in robotics, and then if AI, artificial intelligence, ever moves beyond then, right, and becomes sentient, there is more. And AA places itself on the intersection of all these different groups. And ability studies can be a tool to tackle really the big questions of our day and the future. It's scalable, it can predict things, and what comes in the future, it still does. So, I mean, very, very useful lens to use to constantly be able to deal with the problems of the day and the future. I use many different ability studies concepts, and you can find them on my website. Just to have two. Ability security is the chance for a decent life independent of one's abilities. And when you look at the debate around robotics and so on, it's obviously that a lot of people feel that their abilities won't be enough and they won't have a decent life because their skills simply can't cut it against a robot anymore. And then ability expectation oppression, of course, oppressed by ability expectation of others, but we link this also to colonial theory, a paper I wrote with the eminent feminist and disability studies scholar, Professor Guy from India. Ability expectation can be used to disable, and that's how it's used in the original coining of the term ableism, but it can be actually disable others. For example, man decided the ability of rationality is important, man decided women are not rational, and then man decided therefore women can't vote. And we have many more examples like that, but it can also be used to enable if done right. And I want to focus on equity, diversity, and inclusion as a phrase, which is a strategy increasingly in Canadian universities. And I want to show some problems with it. The book, some take-home messages. Systemic disabling, conscious or unconscious use of irrelevant ability expectations. Animal farm philosophy, some are more equal than others, of who is focused on. Intra and inter-identity conflicts. Danger of internalizing norms. Disabling use of what is defined as research and as evidence. Danger of disablement by being forced into self-denial in order to advance. And this is why the concept of ableism and studies in ableism provide a helpful theoretical framework and an effective lens to theorize and make sense of personal experiences. That is what I see as a take-home message from the book. So EDI in Canada is linked to employment equity language, and this you see here. And when you look at the first two yellows, it's really about I have to define myself as impaired, as indefective, and I have to acknowledge that the disadvantage in employment is purely linked to my impairment. That, of course, is ability, identity, insecurity, whereby identity security is to be able to be at ease with one's abilities, includes that one can build an identity around one set of abilities and that one will not be forced to an expected ability identity. And that's obviously not the case if I have to define myself as a defective product and I have no choice. And I have to acknowledge that, in essence, the employment problems are linked to my impairment. Equity implies that in order to be fair and just, we must acknowledge that people are different and therefore need different support in order to have equal access to opportunities. As such, EDI has to fulfill ability equity. Ability inequity is an unjust or unfair distribution of access to and protection from abilities generated through human intervention, for example, climate change, war. and an unjust and unfair judgment of abilities intrinsic to biological structures, right or wrong. And this is, for example, we see here again, right? I was in essence, right, forced to, right, see myself as impaired, but also a number C includes that, right, I get accommodated based on my limitations. So really because it's my problem and therefore I get accommodated and I have to be grateful. That's of course ability inequity, because ability accommodation are not limited to disabled people. Everyone gets accommodation. A washroom in any building, public building, is an accommodation to start with, right? Because humans can't do very well without a washroom. They can't hold in. Everyone has ability needs. That we make this distinction, I think, comes with consequences. And you can see here the EDI from the University of Toronto. This is a disability group called Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act AOD office. Ensures that UFT is meeting the AOD standard obligation. With other words, this office is a legal compliance office. You can see for the anti-racism cultural diversity office, the language is quite different, right? Denouncing anti-Black racism in all its forms. There is no denying the pain, sadness, and anger that many are feeling given recent events of racialized violence and so on. Much better language. Sexual and gender diversity office is also totally different than the disability one, right? Talking about equity and challenging discrimination, centering principles of equity and intersectionality, inclusive communities, and so on. So why do we not have an office on ability diversity? And then we could have the same positive language than the other groups have. That we don't have, and that it's a compliance office, might lead to why in 2019, 47% of Canadian university professors, instructors, teachers, or researchers experience harassment, and 35% unfair treatment and discrimination. The highest of all the groups here listed. Right. The other problem is, this is the definition based in Canada on the equity, what a disability is. And you can see from the broad coverage that it's really a problem, because all of these different groups have totally different needs, totally different perceptions of themselves and others, totally different way how one has to deal with it to make EDI work. And because we get only numbers for this as a whole group, we don't have sub numbers for the different groups in there, really a problem to make EDI really working. And therefore, conclusion, EDI initiatives around disabled people, right, have potential. Right, ability studies concept can enable EDI discourses like ability identity security, ability equity, decrease in bias of what gets funded by research agencies in relation to disabled people are needed, increase in intersectionality, decrease in silo thinking, increase in transdisciplinary ability studies in ableism as a lens can enable and enrich EDI discourses. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gregor. There are lots of ideas there and lots of things for people to ask questions about. At this stage, I think I will bring in Nicole Brown. Nicole is going to talk about the book and or talk further about the book, because Gregor's begun to do that. Nicole is a lecturer in education at UCL Institute of Education and Director of Social Research and Practice and Education Limited. Sounds like a company. You can explain. Nicole gained a PhD in sociology at the University of Kent for research into the construction of academic identity under the influence of fibromyalgia. In addition to ableism in academia, theorising experiences of disabilities and chronic illnesses in higher education, which is what our webinar is about, she's edited Lived Experiences of Ableism in Academia, Strategies for Inclusion in Higher Education, which is about to be published, I think, yes. Nicole, and co-authored Embodied Inquiry, Research Methods. And Nicole is currently authoring How to Make the Most of Your Research Journal. She has some research interests as well. It's all on the bio on our website. And I think at this point, I'll hand you to Nicole directly.
Thank you very much. So I, first of all, would like to thank everybody for attending this webinar. It's really exciting to see so many people interested in the topic. I would also like to bring in at this stage Jennifer Leigh, who is the second editor on the book. So Jennifer, thank you for putting your video on. So obviously we didn't want to overburden people's attention spans. So I'm just going to very briefly introduce the book, and then I'm going to hand over to Kirstein as one of the representatives of contributors to the book. But basically, we just wanted to share with you the fabulous outcome of what has been a long process. It started in 2018 with a conference at UCL Institute of Education, which was actually held as a conference between several universities, one of them University of Kent, another one University Nottingham. So we've basically worked together with a number of people. Chronically Academic were also part of that. The National Association for Disabled Staff Networks was part of that. So we've had a group of people basically interested in trying to theorize ableism and the experiences of disabilities and ableism in academia. Now, as Gregor has already highlighted some of the takeaway points, I would like to hone in on those. And one of the things that's come out of that was the need for it. That was the first thing that came out. A lot of people were talking about feeling they needed the space and the room and the opportunity to share their experiences and make sense of them publicly. There is a serious issue within academia that many people feel they can't disclose their conditions, and they are basically just trying to keep their issues at bay because they can't publicly disclose their conditions. And this book, as well as the conference, were basically opportunities for individuals to share those experiences and become role models for a number of other people. And as Simon has highlighted, the other book that's being published in the spring term with Policy Press is another outcome from that same kind of project, if you like, with a load of more contributors and different contributors to that as well. One of the key themes that goes through the book is not just the disclosure issue and the stigma that's attached to particular conditions. It's also about how disclosing and being disabled is as much a personal statement as it is a public statement. You have to, basically there is a case of invisible conditions, and you can obviously pass as somebody who doesn't have a condition, but if you then say, hey ho, I have got whatever condition it is, suddenly this becomes an activist stance and a public statement and a political statement as well. And the final thing that I'd like to sort of touch upon very briefly is the fact that within academia, we've got a lot of people who are actually, in a way, struggling with internalized ableism. And I think that's probably the most difficult issue that we are grappling with, because all of us have got a particular expectation of what is normal and what we would expect to be normal. And as soon as you're being diagnosed with a condition, you find out actually you don't really fit that criterion anymore. So there is this thing that actually there is an internal struggle as much as an external one with, you know, reasonable adjustments, etc. I have checked through the participants list, and I'm proud to say that we have got some other contributors here as well. So I would just like to say a very brief hello and shout out to Elizabeth Griffiths, chapter 7, Kirstein, who is going to talk about her book, Jennifer, who has contributed to chapters 8 and 10 and the conclusion, and Nikki Martin, who's written chapter 5. So as you can see, between us, we're actually covering quite a lot of ground here. The beauty of the book is that it's combining theorization with personal experiences. And this is really one of the examples that Kirstein is going to talk about, because her chapter, it was called From the Personal to the Political. Sorry, yes, From the Personal to the Political, Ableism, Activism and Academia. And in that, she's talking about her personal experiences as well as making sense of those experiences in a theoretical, scholarly way. So with that, I would like to hand over to Kirstein.
And thank you so much for that. And thank you for asking me to contribute to the book, because one of the things that I'd like to say is the process of writing this kind of thing because you're actually laying yourself bare, and you're laying yourself and your own experiences on the table, and you're trying to be analytical and rational and theoretical about them, but they're still your own experiences. They're still highly personal to you. And you have that kind of emotional engagement as well as the kind of lived experience sort of thing. You can't distance yourself completely from your own personal experiences, which is both a good and a bad thing. But the editors were absolutely brilliant. I just want to take the opportunity to thank them in terms of how supportive they were throughout the whole process, and how excited we all were when we saw the finished product, and also how proud I felt that I'd been part of something. Yeah, exactly. It's brilliant. Go and get it. It's absolutely brilliant. Everyone else's chapter is much better than mine, but I'll talk a little bit about my chapter. And I started out my research career as a postdoctorate with no personal experience of disability. I was a woman, so I had experience of gender, feminism, and I'd experienced as a PhD student lots of stuff around that. But I just had a kind of rational, distanced interest in what was happening around disability and work, because it looked to me like there were some really interesting parallels between how disabled people were experiencing work and exclusion and how women were experiencing work and exclusion that hadn't really been explored apart from some really key authors like Jenny Morris and people like that. But it was sort of at the edge of feminist studies, and it was sort of at the edge of disability studies, this kind of intersection. So that's what I started to do. Can I just say, if you are a postdoc and you're starting to do work in this area, don't do work in this area, do work in the area of women who unexpectedly win the lottery or come into large sums of money. Because what will happen to you almost immediately is all of the things that you're theorizing about will actually happen in practice. So I was in a car accident, I had various illnesses, including fibromyalgia, and I also had a disabled son. So I became a carer and a disabled person. And I had all of this lovely theoretical stuff to explain what was happening to me. But that sort of, you know, theoretical activism came before my personal experience. But with disability, it was kind of, yeah, it was the other way around. I had the theoretical stuff and then I had the activism. But with feminism, I had the activism and then I had the personal experience. And one of the personal experiences, which I talk about in the chapter, is that as an undergraduate, I was raped on campus. I'm now a professor of social policy, and I have to support undergraduate students who get raped on campus. And that was, without revealing my age, 30 years have happened and not a lot has happened on that. So I thought, okay, I need to become political with a small p about this. And there's a lot of stuff around activism, both in feminism and in disability studies. And if we're not activists as academics, we're not doing our job properly, because we're dealing with oppression, we're dealing with inequality, we're dealing with the things that actually have a radical influence on people's lives. So this chapter is, just to put it shortly, an experience of going out of sort of political activism into political activism with a big P and running for Parliament as a parliamentary candidate, which I did in the 2017 elections. I ran for the Women's Equality Party, so there was no way I was going to win. So that was quite useful because it meant I could take a step back from the pressure of having to win and be a real candidate and do an autoethnography of what it's like to immerse yourself in that world, to be a political candidate, both as a disabled person, but also as a woman. And I discovered, weirdly, that I encounter much more ableism within the academy than I do within political world. But I encountered a lot more anti-woman feeling in the political world, and a lot more of the overt attacks in the political world than I did in the academy. And I talk a little bit about, you know, there was really obvious things like hustings being held in inaccessible venues, being asked to stand up by an audience member, and everybody standing up except me because I physically couldn't stand up. And then it was really obvious that I wasn't standing up. But also that link between me as an activist and my personal experience also resonated with people who were in the hall. So a lot of people came up to me and said, it's fantastic that you are very visibly disabled. I walk with a crutch, because more disabled people should be standing, but also a lot of the electorate are disabled. And a lot of the issues that concern us are around public services that really disproportionately affect disabled people's lives. And politicians never talk about this because they've never experienced it. And it's fantastic that you're talking about it. But on the other hand, I got a lot of attacks, a lot of things saying, you know, how is this woman who is quite clearly not cognitively able to do the job, how can she run for parliament? How would she be able to deal with all of the stuff that comes at you as an MP? And I'm sitting there and I'm like, I'm a professor of social policy. I deal with a lot of complex information. I think I can manage what an MP does, but it was that sort of, you know, because there was a physical impairment on obvious, that my mental faculties were talked about. I was very open about my experience of mental health issues as well. And that was very good at connecting with the electorate, but also increased attacks. You know, people who are unstable shouldn't be running for parliament. And I'm just going to ask you to look at the people who are actually in parliament at the moment and the degree of instability that we might be seeing there, and just say, I really don't think that should be a bar to the job, because it quite clearly isn't a bar to the job if you are a white middle-class man who went to a public school. But I'll leave that aside. On the final thing I wanted to say, what I really discovered was the intersectionality issue mattered. So it wasn't just about gender. In my class, stuff, you can hear my voice. I was running in Scotland, but I'm English. I sounded posh. I sounded middle class. I sounded like I was part of the elite that become MPs, even though I'm not actually. This is the way I've learnt to talk, as Goffman would say, to pass in higher education, as someone who actually has that kind of background, because I learnt fairly early on, if you had a working class accent in higher education, people didn't take you very seriously. One of the things I could do to alter that was, but I can't alter my inability to walk. I can't alter the inability to, so fibromyalgia also gives you a brain fog. I can't alter that. That's really obvious. So I can hide some of my impairments and I can't hide others. So I had a class advantage, even though it's not a real one. But I also had a class advantage from being in higher education. And oh boy, when you're working in social policy and you have access to stats, and they're real stats and they're real research, and you can absolutely pull the rug out of any other politician who's just lying and making it up. That is a brilliant feeling. I would absolutely advocate anybody uses their research experience in any kind of way possible. That gives you the advantage. But finally, you know, there were other women running for the Women's Equality Party at the time who were Black, who were disabled, and they received a hell of a lot more abuse and lack of constructive support, both from the public, but from other political parties as well. So I was protected from that, A, by being in the academy, and B, by being a white middle-class woman who could argue her ground, kind of thing. And just to finally say, yes, there's ableism in the academy, but it's because there's ableism in the wider society, is what I would say. We don't see very many disabled women running for parliament because we don't see many disabled women in positions of power, generally. There's nothing particular about political world that is putting up more kind of ableist barriers than anywhere else. And actually, one of the things I did reflect on is, to a certain extent, we are protected within the academy because we have things like reasonable adjustments, because there are legislation and statutory protections in place, and because we can speak openly about these things, and we can turn that theoretical lens on our own lives and therefore turn it on other people's lives, to take it beyond being just a personal experience that happens to me, to being actually something that is about systematic oppression. And there are theories there that help us understand that systematic oppression. That is actually tremendously enabling to other people. So I think we do have a responsibility within that protection of the academy to do exactly what we're doing in this book, which is, you know, reveal some of the things that are happening and talk about them in a very informed theoretical kind of way. And I'll leave it there because we need to leave time for questions. But it was an absolute joy to write. It was very weird to write because I'm not used to turning the attention on my own life. I'm used to turning on attention on other people out there who are experiencing things. But it was really, really nice.
Well, thanks, Kirsten. That was a very effective speech. And all three of you, I think, have added a lot. I should introduce Kirsten. I don't know what we called it when we introduce someone after they've spoken. we could call it a conclusion, but that would be implying that you're not going to speak again, which you most certainly, I'm sure, are going to speak again. Kirstein is Professor of Social Policy at the University of Stirling, where her research interests include comparative social policy, gender equality and disability rights, particularly with regards to health and social care. She is disabled and a carer, as you have heard, and a gender and disability rights activist. She's a founder member of the Women's Equality Party and a board member of Inclusion Scotland. Thank you all three, and let me invite any of the book authors who want to come into the discussion. We've got quite a bit of time, about half an hour. Jennifer Leigh, one of the editors, may want to speak at some point, and I'm sure other authors will be most welcome. So put yourselves forward. We have a bit in the chat and a couple of questions already coming through. I'm going to ask one myself, though, of all three. The problem of the academy and the rest of the world. We advance people's rights in the academy sometimes better than the rest of the world, and sometimes the rest of the world and us seem to be on about the same plane. I mean, I'm thinking of gender, for example. I mean, I think we've probably made more progress on gender inside universities than we have outside, but there's lots and lots of problems inside universities too. We won't diminish those, but things seem to be a little better. And I think Kirstein's story about what happens when you go into the political space, when suddenly the pushback on gender is sharper, almost Trumpian at times, horrible, and you're not allowed to do that in higher education. I mean, that's not acceptable in a highly feminized environment like ours. So how does this work with disability and ability? You know, if you make progress in higher education, is it imperiled because there's not sufficient progress outside? To what extent do activists think of changing in society as opposed to changing their immediate environment? How do you manage that balance? I mean, all three, I think, might want to say something about this. Should you be active, putting all your effort into working in the community? Should it be primarily about the workplace, students, staff?
I can say something about this because it's similar to the feminist thing, which is, you know, is the onus on women to remove gender depression around them all the time in their workplace? No, the onus should be on men to do that as well. But we can only do it, we can only encourage men to do it when it becomes something that is in their interests and that enough women have created space to do that. And also when you've got institutional support. I mean, I know you said that we've come a long way, but you look above a certain level, certainly in certain disciplines, you know, vice chancellors are overwhelmingly men, senior management levels in all universities are still overwhelmingly men. And if they are paying attention to things, it's partly because of internal pressure, but also partly because of legislative pressure and institutional, reputational kind of pressure. I don't think we're at the stage where we have those kinds of levers within the academy around disability. And I think it's partly because we are still learning. We're still learning about, you know, we're still developing theories, we're still challenging each other, which is brilliant in terms of doing it as it's a very lively, wonderful, cutting edge discipline to be in. But that means that we're not actually embedded within, for example, sociological ideas about things. You know, I was asked to do a chapter on disability for a sociology textbook last year, and it's one of the mainstream sociology textbooks that's been running since the 60s. And it's the first time they thought they might want to have a chapter on disability. So I think we're quite a long way behind in kind of social recognition, which means we're also quite a long way behind in the kind of powers that we can do within our institutions. Having said that, some of us are making noises, some of us are in positions to make changes, and like women who are in positions to make changes in favour of other women, disabled people should be trying to make changes as much as they can for other people, but without, let's not go the route where we say the burden is on us disabled people in the academy to change the academy. Because let's face it, we've all got a lot to do, and sometimes just surviving in the academy takes a hell of a lot of our emotional, intellectual and physical resources. And asking us to be activists within the academy on top of that without support from non-disabled activists, I think is asking a lot.
Yeah, I mean, I often feel that we know because of the agency which higher education brings to us, the kind of fluency, the capacity to analyze and speak and so on, all those sorts of things. We should be taking that to the general community as much as we can. And I mean, you can absorb your energy completely in trying to fix up the workplace and fight the internal battle inside the university and nothing really changes, etc. But sometimes you can make great headway outside, but that isn't to say that inside isn't important. I mean, this is a kind of dilemma, I think, that we all sometimes feel when there's a crisis inside the institution, a problem that arises and absorbs all our energy. Nicole, I think we should bring you in at this point. You might want to comment as well.
Yeah, sorry. So one of the things that I do take a little bit umbrage with is we have come a long way. The sentence "we have come a long way" may well be true to an extent, but we haven't really come a long way when you look at statistics. There are so many statistics that demonstrate that at undergraduate level, students are actually, there. They say they have got any kind of conditions, chronic illness or disabilities or neurodiversity, but then that trickles off. You look at the postgraduate taught numbers, that's already flattened down. You then look at postgraduate research, that's flattening down further. And when you then look at staff, it's even lower. So the question is, what's happening here? It's not, yes, we have come a long way. There are a lot of disabled students at universities now that have never been able to go to university. I agree. But when you look at academia in terms of a working place, it's a completely different story. So on the one hand, we have got people who feel they can't say they've got a condition. There's that. But then we also have a number of people that we are losing. And I think that's the worry. We are losing some really important, relevant people with important, relevant ideas, with fantastic brains, just because we can't actually accommodate them in the way we are working within academia. So I don't quite agree with the sentence "we have come a long way," because we haven't really, when you look at it. In terms of looking at comparing academia with the wider society, actually in wider society, more disabled people are employed than they are in academia. That's got to tell you something, and actually that's quite shocking. So as far as I'm concerned, I do agree that things have to change, and I also agree with what Kirstein is saying about activist work not really being supported. It's not part of the research excellence framework, so therefore it doesn't count much. And it's extra work. And actually, if you're speaking to anyone who's got a condition, managing that condition, managing those symptoms, managing all of those therapeutic appointments that you got, whether that's rehab or whether that's physio or whether that's just going to your regular blood draw, whatever it is, but all of those appointments take time and energy that somebody else who's not disabled, who doesn't have those chronic conditions, doesn't have to deal with. So trying to then say to those people, you have to be activists to basically make the situation better for yourself, is actually a double whammy. And that's something that I'm really, really passionate I've got my issues with, let's put it that way. Which is why I'm saying, we have to listen to individuals, but at the same time, we have to say to those individuals, you know what, standing up here and saying that you have got whatever condition you have is a very brave act. And rather than trying to put you down for it because you don't fit with the research excellence framework, I'm going to acknowledge the extra hours and the extra energy that you need.
Gregor, do you want to add to this conversation at this point? Gregor.
Gregor, you're on mute.
I'm sorry to typing. Yeah, sure. I mean, around identity, that's why I showed this long list. It's really a problem, right? Because, for example, I denounce people first language, right? Which we have, for example, others like it. I denounce it because when you look at my definition, I question, because in at least North America, people first language means that you're automatically seen as having a chronic illness, an impairment, a disease. And then it might make sense to say people first. But what are the ones like deaf culture, neurodiversity, me in a wheelchair who self-identify as I don't walk, but I do not identify as walking impaired, right? The same as a normal human can't fly, but they don't identify as flying impaired, right? So that's why I think, I mean, when we're looking at these discourses, they are too crude, as in putting everything together. I mean, people come from different positionalities. And given that, for example, by now in Canada, 50% of the disabled students are linked to mental health, right? The demographic is quite different to the times when I went to a university, which was really more about the wheelchair, the blind, the deaf, and so on. So all of that is changing, and we haven't found a good way how to deal with even these changes, with all these groups having different identities, having different needs, having different ways how they, I mean, talk about each other's. I mean, we just normatize like into people first language, and then you sit there. Right, and that's why ableism is so important, or the disabling one, because I think this can be a bridge, because everyone experiences the disabling use of someone else's ability expectation. That is nothing special to any one of us, or to, in essence, of us. Right? As I said with women, rationality is often used to discredit your opposition, including the, for example, right, industry saying GM food, people are irrational if you're an activist, right? Or the irrational worker if they ask for certain things. So we have a lot of, I mean, ways how to do abilities, any given ability to disable a group we want to disable. Right, and again, we have two schools here. Some say broadening the term is dangerous, and I think I want to get out of my ghetto of, as if my theorizing has no really linkage to the rest of the world. Whereas I think when we're looking at the cyborg humans, transhuman, the robotics, artificial intelligence, whereas we are very likely way ahead of, I think, the dangers in society, where people are increasingly judging themselves based on abilities, totally independent of the label of impairment or whatever.
Very thought-provoking, and makes me think about education as a whole and the way in which it implies that we know nothing when we begin, and how that robs us of agency, and how we lose so many people from self-learning and self-formation at that point. We've got a number of people who've been saying interesting things, and I'm going to bring in Nicola Martin at this point. I think she wants to talk about disclosure.
Yeah, hi. I wrote one of the chapters about disabled leaders in higher education. I absolutely detest the word disclosure because it sounds like some kind of guilty secret. And the participants who contributed to the research which underpins my study talked a lot about disclosure in those terms, and also that within the academy, acknowledging that you're a disabled person doesn't necessarily lead to any sort of support, because basically there's a lot of chaos around services, very minor reasonable adjustments which could help disabled academics. Absolutely operationalizing them in simple ways is just, we're a million miles away from that at the moment. It just doesn't happen. And I talk a lot about universal design for learning and trying to have a sort of baseline where we just assume diversity and the value of diversity and put things in place that work, you know, like technology that works and so on for everybody. But disclosure, I think, is a horrible word, and I'm really interested to know if anybody else has got a view on that.
Jennifer Leigh.
Thank you. Yeah, there's so much to say, isn't there? There's so many different points. So when you were talking about how far academia has come, particularly in terms of gender balance, I was thinking, not in every discipline. It really hasn't. No. I'm involved at the moment in doing a lot of work in chemistry, which is one of the worst for gender balance. And in terms of even EDI things, there was a call for papers looking at EDI within chemistry education recently on Twitter, and the comments that were trolling it from chemists who are like, we don't need to worry about EDI, we just need to do the chemistry, we just need to teach the subject. And I think the thing with academia is there's that perception that actually it's the cognitive ability that is the most important thing, and any EDI issue is just secondary, because if you're clever enough, then you'll succeed and you'll get there and you'll become a leader. And yet we know from Nikki Martin's work, we know from lived experience, from Kirstein, from so many of the other contributors, that that's just not the case, you know. You're right, disclosure is something that's a bit icky, isn't it? And if you disclose, who you're disclosing to, and then are you going to become the person with that condition? Is that how you want to be known, or do you want to be known as an academic who researches something? It's
all that. Can I just come back as well on disclosure, that the thing that a lot of my participants observed was that then they completely lost control of their personal information, because there are lots of there's a lot of examples of information being passed on, not maliciously, just because people didn't really realize that confidentiality was actually part of the deal. So, you know, losing control of your identity, even, you know, this idea disclosure carries with it an ontological risk. Well, you're not joking.
Exactly. And that thing, if you tell someone something and I need this, and they ask why, or even if you're being involved in whether it's a disabled staff network or even an event like this, and people looking at you, so what's wrong with you? Why are you involved in this? And there's a certain amount of curiosity and people want to know, or hold you up as a role model, you know, like with all of the super Olympics, that's the wrong word, isn't it? But you know, they're superhuman, which in a way is great that disability is being normalized. But on the other hand, it shouldn't be something that my words have gone completely. It shouldn't be something that becomes special and extraordinary in its own right, because
one
it's
of
not
my
superhuman.
Participants talked about flag waving. So he was a professor in a completely other discipline, nothing to do with critical disability studies, and had a visible impairment, and was sort of felt like he was being dragged out whenever the Equality Act was mentioned, which was a real massive irritant.
All of these things are intersectional. So if you're a woman in a gender imbalanced discipline and you have a disability, and if you're from an ethnic minority, you know, we aren't one identity in isolation. We're all a combination of different identities for different purposes.
Thanks, Nicole and Jennifer. I've got a few other people on the list. I know Nicole's keen to come in again. Nicole, I'll bring you in, but just let me tell everyone that I've got Terry Hewitt, Edwin Thomas, Vivian Ruff, and LC as people that I would like to come in at some point. So, but Nicole, there are many things to respond to, I'm sure.
Yeah, I just wanted to say about the disclosure thing. I know that disclosure as a term is difficult, but then the whole process is difficult, because just think of yourselves as somebody who's not had a condition, and then suddenly, you know, whatever diagnosis you're being given by your doctor, having to then say at work, I have got whatever mental health issue, for example, depression, that actually requires you to admit it to yourself first. So although I agree with Nikki saying, you know, that the term disclosure is problematic, I think the whole process of actually admitting to yourself that you need help, that there is an issue, that makes the whole process difficult as well. So it's not just the terminology, it's actually the process that's difficult.
I don't think Terry Hewitt wants to come in, but can I bring in Edmund Thomas? Hey, Edmund. No? Hello, Edmund.
Oh, sorry. I haven't actually specifically requested to intervene, but it's okay. I just want to highlight things about people suffering from chronic pain, and particularly, and then regarding with expectations about time and energy and thing required in our academic environments, and the difficulty of, I suppose in the same way as the previous speaker, a difficulty of, say, of acknowledging that both to oneself and then also to the employers. I think that is just something I just wanted to highlight.
Thanks, Edmund. And you've also said lots of other things in the chat as well. Thanks for that.
Yes, I made it, yeah, particularly. I felt you say, well, I have noticed with her in my university that, in fact, with all kinds and then of discriminations and so on, that actually science departments have tended to be a little bit more and a little bit behind in the humanities department in this respect. I don't know, behind a little bit, but I don't think that actually humanities departments either are particularly when it comes to ableism. I think that they are much seem to be able to kind of deal with or gender issues and other kinds of difference, but ableism is one area that's still, I think, struggling to come to terms with, actually, and to recognise.
Any comments from our speakers?
Can I just come back on the disclosure thing? Because at different points in your career, you have different kinds of social agency and different kinds of power. And if you are like me and you're a professor and you've been doing things for years, you've got a little bit more power in your institution than an early career researcher might have, or even a lecturer might have. I've got the power to take the problems to do with disclosure and turn them into a positive. So I'm very, very open. Everybody knows I'm completely mad. Everybody knows I have fibromyalgia. Everybody knows I walk with a stick. And that is fine because I've got, you know, you didn't read out my CV, but I've got billions of pounds of grants. I've got all of the research things that I need to do. I've done ticked all of the boxes the university has asked me to tick, so I can afford to be a little bit of a troublemaker. Most people are not in that position. And they're certainly not in the position to be able to lay their own lives bare and to address their own internalized ableism. And of course, we are a profession that really values cognitive ability above anything else. And anything that questions that cognitive ability, and it doesn't even need to be a mental health issue. It could be any kind of impairment that could be perceived as having some kind of influence on your competence. Then that we automatically see, we already see everything closing around us and all of those opportunities and that sort of soft social capital disappearing. The other side of, and it's a positive and a negative, of being really open with your disclosure and telling absolutely everybody that you are a completely wonky madster, is that you get all of the undergraduate dissertations that have got anything to do with disability. You get all of the personal tutees who have self-disclosed that they need reasonable accommodations. And you get all of the master's students that have any kind of issue, as though the institution, okay, we've put all of these students and also mentoring early career researchers, we've put all of these people with Kirstein, who knows what she's doing, which she doesn't, can I just say, you know, just because I talk about this stuff doesn't mean I actually have a magic kind of, you know, wand to fix it all. So we've got all of the 25, 30, whatever % of students who've got issues with Kirstein. Nobody else has to deal with that. Everybody else can just get on with their day jobs. And they don't actually have to change their behavior. They don't have to deal with, you know, how do I present things accessibly to autistic students? How do I be more inclusive in my practice? How do I do all of this stuff? How do I bring that to the table? And so disclosure can be positive and negative. But again, what really, really worries me is that we are a stage in the academy where individuals have to take on board what I think is a completely unreasonable burden about challenging discrimination, challenging our own institutions, challenging our own disciplines for some of us. I mean, social science has been really, really good at this. Critical disability studies nests really happily in social science. It doesn't, as Jennifer's pointed out, rest really, really happily in chemistry or other kinds of places. And I wouldn't even say, even within social sciences, that we have got it made, because I've you know, I can see people's attitudes and discriminatory behavior certainly coming through in formal procedures that are meant to protect us, but actually disenable us and make the things worse for us. You know, highlighting, oh, this person has a mental health issue, so they're allowed to bring their union representative. Nobody else is allowed to bring their union representative, which is a whole, you know, other kinds of things. But I just think, you know, yes, we have to be brave, but this is where people like Nicole and Jennifer are incredibly important, because it's people not just in our institutions, but outside of our institutions, in our disciplines, in the academy generally, who are supporting us, who are holding us up, you know, who are the wind beneath our wings when we do stuff like that. It's like the feminist movement. You can't have one woman. You need to have the feminist movement behind you when you're calling out, you know, sexism. If you're calling out ableism, you need to have the disability rights movement behind you, particularly in academia, particularly with people who understand what you're going through in academia, because as my chapter points out, it's completely different when you do it as an activist, and it's completely different when you do it as a politician. Academia has a very particular way of being ableist, and the support that we give each other is absolutely invaluable to that, to tackling that, I mean.
We've got a couple of minutes left. I'd like to bring in Emma Shepherd, who's got to leave at on the dot of 3. Emma, are you still there?
Hiya. Yeah, I'm still here. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, we can.
Woo. Sorry, yes, I do have to run away at 3 o'clock to teach. I think I was, what did I say actually? Sorry, my brain has just kind of got shorted out. Yeah, talking about disclosure, and the kind of disclosure to me implies that it happens once, whereas it's quite often a very much something that you have to go through again and again. And also what Kirstein was saying just now kind of made me think as well, thinking about how we shape our disclosure depending on who we're talking to as well. It's and what we want them to do about it. Like, I know it sounds like a slightly awkward phrasing, but that idea of like how it's not just how we want them to respond, but what action we want them to take, whether we're disclosing, whether we're telling them for information, or whether we want them to actually do something, or whether we just need them to do something. And I would say want and need being very different things there as well. And I think LC had a point in the chat as well that was really good about thinking about you as your needs change, or as you realize things are different, you need to start disclosing again. I thought that was really good. So yeah, that was my
thanks, Emma. I mean, I think we're at the point where we need to move to final statements, and perhaps people could respond to Emma in making those final statements if they want. And I'll take those statements in the order of the speakers, if that's okay. And do bear in mind that we are talking about the book when you make your final statement. Gregor, can you come in, please?
So what am I to comment on? Because I was just typing, so I wasn't listening.
I understand. I think we're summing up now, Gregor.
Yeah.
So far away.
Okay, for me is really, I mean, the book is important, but we really have to move away to see ableism as it's disabled people. That's why we get this, well, no one was showing up, because people think it's not impacting them. And I think when we're making fun of the plumber, right, and say everyone has to go to university to be valued, right, that's impacting everyone. If you're looking at the the World Economic Forum's job report, how it's shifting with technologies, right, automatization, robotics, and so on, right, and the retraining, which of course isn't happening, right, the ability expectation and ableism, and the expectation of that we share certain abilities and others we don't, it goes far beyond us. It's really a societal issue, at least I think. And that has to be dealt with, therefore, in a much more holistic way. And we are just, how you call it? We are just a spearheading in essence, but to think that what we have to say is only for disabled people, and ableism is really only about discrimination against disabled people, that's where we're getting put into a corner. And then, and I think the rest shoots themselves in the foot, because what do you do with the trucker if all by a sudden all the trucks drive by themselves? I mean, there's no way you can all train them to become IT specialists, right? The de-skilling, retraining, all this talk is, right? I mean, it's, right, there's so much to it, right? And if, right, and to the idea that everyone has to go through university, and of course, I come from Germany where we have a lot of stuff around apprenticeship. But I mean, if you belittle the plumber and the roofer and whatever, And you say you can only be, I mean, getting accolades, right? If you are at the university, I think we are already dead in the water as a society. Everyone should be cherished for the abilities they have. And if we don't do that, we will get more and more infighting and who tries to go where and so on.
Thanks, Gregor. I think your conceptual working of the problem is really helpful and widens the discussion to everyone very effectively. Nicole, would you like to come in?
Thank you. I just wanted to say thank you. I'm very happy that we have been able to put this webinar together. I'm absolutely grateful to Gregor for joining us at unfeasible hours. I'm also incredibly grateful to Kirstein and Jennifer to be here today, to basically moral support as much as contributing, but also to anyone who's joined here today out of interest and out of wanting to learn more. And I think that's the kind of thing that helps us in the long term to actually make the changes that are needed. So please do spread the word. That's all I'm asking, and thank you.
Thanks, Nicole. I've certainly learned quite a lot from this, and it's been a pleasure and an honour to chair it. Kirstein, you've got the final word.
Okay, I've already talked a lot, but what I really want to do is say thank you. Everybody involved in this webinar, everybody who wrote this book, everybody who reads this book is now part of a fantastic network. And you have to use that network. The only way we get significant political change is through group action and through supporting each other. So, you know who we are. Email us from your institutions when you are doing your research, when you are encountering it in real life. And of course, we do know that those two things absolutely overlap. And all of you, if you go away with nothing else, go away with the message that you need to introduce one other person to this book and one other person to the idea of this tackling ableism in academia being all of our jobs, not just people who are working in critical disability studies. It's up to everybody. And we will do it if we all do it.
Thanks, Kirstein. This is a reminder, isn't it, that words do matter. I mean, we're social beings. We form our sociability through language, through exchange of ideas and words and shared feelings with each other. And I think today did that really well. So thank you very much for taking part, and thank you to everyone for setting this up. Thank you, Gregor, for coming in outside the time zone. Really appreciate it, and you added a lot to the discussion by doing that.
Thank you. I'm all the time happy to do stuff with UCL, given that I did my biochem diploma at UCL.
There you are, and I used to be there as well. Yes,
and very interesting maybe was at that time, the wheelchair was not allowed in a lab, right, because of safety reasons. And so I could only get my biochem degree because I could use legs, artificial legs, right? But I was, I mean, that opposite Dylan's or whatever the bookstore was, and that seven-story, I mean, old building of UCL, right? So in the 80s, so I have a lot of nice memories from UCL in general and the people there.
Good. Excellent. Next week, we are back on the pandemic in the UK, and our Tuesday webinar will be on student learning in the midst of the pandemic, but we're going to focus especially on online learning and what's been happening there with Kungmi Leigh, Ben Williamson and Naomi Winstone. So look forward to seeing everyone then. Thank you very much for today's speakers, and congratulations on such an effective presentation and such an interesting book.
Thank you.
Bye for now.